back to Revolutionary Roads, a podcast of the North Carolina History Project here at the John Locke Foundation. We're in episode 9, and I'm your host, Donald Bryson. I'm CEO of the John Locke Foundation, and I've had a great time walking through North Carolina's very rich, robust history of its role in the American Revolution. In our last few episodes, we've talked through the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, and we talked about the Battle of Kings Mountain. Really, the military conflict comes much later for the most part to North Carolina as we get into 1780 and 1781. If you've liked that content and you've liked what we heard in earlier episodes, please like, share, subscribe, share with your friends, tell people about this podcast because we think it's an important history to talk about for our state. But now that we're winding down the actual military conflict, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse was in March of 1781. Cornwallis didn't really get what he wanted out of the invasion of North Carolina, went to Wilmington for a few months, and finally finds himself going north into Virginia, where he's trapped by the French and George Washington at the Battle of Yorktown and thereby surrenders, which generally brings the military conflict to a close. And then we'll arrange for a peace agreement with the British in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. But now that we are independent and the war is over, how do we build a government? And that's the question that we're coming with today with our guest, Dr. Andrew Taylor. He is a professor of political science at North Carolina State University and a great friend of the John Locke Foundation. And I don't think I've given you this before, but you're such a great friend to John Locke. I want to give you these John Locke socks.
Oh, well,
so
thank you.
They're a gift from us to you.
I actually do have a pair.
Well, now you have two pairs.
Yeah,
that's
I
very
wear
good.
them. I don't have them on
That's
today,
great.
but I do wear them.
But now that North Carolina wrote its first constitution in November of 1776 with the 5th Provincial Congress, and we covered that here a few episodes ago with Jeanette Doran of the Institute for Constitutional Law. But federally, now what do we do? We are, in fact, independent. What do we do? And you'll notice he has an interesting accent, but we'll talk about that later.
Yes. But particularly for a topic like this.
It is.
So essentially, until the Constitution is written in May of 1787, or the summer of 1787, and the Constitutional Convention meets in May of 1787, we are, and by we I mean the 13 states, I don't just mean North Carolina, governed by a loose arrangement called the Articles of Confederation. It's sort of a loose, a document with a variety of different rules and procedures that I'm sure we'll be talking about that brings the 13 states together, largely for the practical purposes of kind of finishing the war and working out what to do next.
Right.
North Carolina actually doesn't ratify the Articles of Confederation until until the middle of 1778. We're the 10th state to do so. Right. It's not formally ratified until the 13th state does so, which is Maryland in 1781.
Really?
So, yes, Maryland is late to the game. By the way, North Carolina is pretty late to a lot of games. I just mentioned we were the 10th state to ratify the Articles of Confederation. Of course, we're the 12th state to ratify the Constitution later on.
Right. And then we were the final state to get into the Confederacy at the Civil War.
Yes. So North Carolina has never really been first at these kinds of things.
No.
Maybe we'll sort of talk a little bit about this later on. So the Articles take effect. They are, I mentioned, a loose, and I think the emphasis should be on loose. This is nothing like the Constitution is going to be like.
Right.
Several years later, the emphasis is on the states retain sovereignty.
Right.
They get together, but there is no, in this new confederacy, this confederate arrangement, there is no executive. There is no judicial branch. The forum is what they call a Confederate Congress, a Confederation Congress, that is a kind of debating and talking chamber as much as anything, where strategy is plotted out. And of course, the Articles of Confederation were really created for wartime. And as you mentioned in the introduction, Donald, we're getting to the end of that for all practical purposes. By the time Maryland ratifies, the fighting is nearly over.
Right.
And we see, of course, or many people do see, the Articles as being kind of insufficient and inadequate for the period between Yorktown, or maybe the Treaty of Paris will go to 1783, and then, the Constitutional Convention, those sort of 4 years between 1783 and 1787.
The Articles of Confederation, it's an interesting time, and I would call it a dark time in that not that it was necessarily depressing, but in that the records of what happened nationally and understanding our national history are probably diminished compared to many other parts of history, because we get to Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris, and then I think for a lot of high school and college students in the United States, the period is dark. And then, we have a Constitution that comes up a few years later. What happens in between? And that's sort of what we have.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that, but I think you're right.
Yeah. So, I mean, who was the president under the Articles of Confederation? Was there a president under the Articles of Confederation?
Yeah. I mean, there's no executive. Right. The states retain sovereignty. They retain the power to tax. So there's no revenue at the national level. It really is a way for them to debate matters that are obviously of importance given their proximity to one another and the fact that they are thousands of miles away from Europe. But it quickly becomes clear, at least to many people with strong federal persuasion. Right. And we'll talk about this, I'm sure, because this is going to be a big debate in North Carolina.
Absolutely.
That the articles are, as I said, inadequate. There is some stuff between 1783 and 1787, like the Annapolis Convention, for example, which really is the first signpost that we're going to be getting something beyond the Articles of Confederation. In fact, the delegates of the Annapolis Convention sort of say, well, we've got to meet again for the purposes of looking at what we should do with these articles, because there is a real problem. And of course, that's the Philadelphia Convention that comes the next year.
Right.
It does seem to be a kind of hole.
It does. Let me ask you a little bit about you.
Yes.
If that's all right. So you teach at NC State.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that a lot of your work and research has been on American governmental institutions. Yep. But you've got this great accent that you didn't get from anywhere in the United States.
No.
How long, where are you from, and how long have you been in the U.S.?
I'm from the UK originally. I'm from a place called Reading, which is about 40 miles west of London. Mm-hmm. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Kent at Canterbury. I'm sure many of the listeners know Canterbury. I visited Canterbury and the cathedral there, home of the Anglican Church, of course. Mm-hmm. And then I came to go to graduate school in the United States. So I've really been in the US since '88. So that's, 37 years, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I've been at NC State for 30.
Okay.
So, compared to a lot of people in the Raleigh and Triangle area, I've actually been here a lot longer than most of them.
You've been in Raleigh longer than I have.
Yeah. I've seen the area grow tremendously, obviously, over 30 years.
Sure. So, American governmental institutions. What was it that drew you to that? Because the British governmental institutions are fascinating to me. Well, because they're so different.
That's what drew me. Right, okay. There is a tremendous difference. We're not going to really be talking about the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention in this episode. I'd be happy to come back and spend a lot of time talking about the Constitution, because obviously that's the document that established our federal government. Mm-hmm. It didn't come up with the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances, which is the key features, of course, of our federal government, because many of those were in operation in the states, and the ideas were those of others, including going back to John Locke, and funnily enough, who talked about separation of powers, but particularly Montesquieu, who was a tremendous influence on our founders as well in regards to this particular issue. By the way, North Carolina, you mentioned North Carolina Constitution, 1776. It has a sort of separation of powers. It has an
explicitly.
It has an executive and a legislative branch. By the way, basically, as is the case in North Carolina today, it was a situation of legislative supremacy.
It is,
and it is the case today. We had an executive, we had a governor, 1 year term, by the way, back then.
We go through governors very fast in the early days.
Although really only 3 governors dominate the 1780s period that we're talking about.
I think that's right. Yeah,
Richard Carswell and
Abner Nash.
Alexander Martin and then Samuel Johnston.
Right.
So the separation of powers goes back, and but I was fascinated by that form of government compared to the parliamentary style government that in Britain, where the executive is sort of subsumed in the legislative branch and in the legislative branch, and there aren't these separated branches. There's not an independent election of the executive, etc.
It's very interesting. So to your point, the Articles of Confederation were a wartime document. They began drafting them in 1777. The drafting committee is an interesting group of people. Samuel Adams is in there. You never think of Samuel Adams as sort of a document drafter or as a builder of anything beyond a political movement, but he was in there. Button Gwinnett from Georgia. Joseph Hughes from North Carolina, who was actually instrumental in building the United States Navy. It's an interesting group that they put together, but they come out with this Articles of Confederation, and it's a list of just articles to its name. But Article 1 is the style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America. Article 2, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. I'm not going to go down through all those, but I think those two are important for two different reasons. The first is they come up with the name United States of America. That's where they first name it. The second, in Article 1, they use the term confederacy, and I think that a lot of people who maybe don't dig into history too deeply would be surprised that the term confederacy did not begin with the Confederate States of America. That's an old term.
Yes.
A very old term, going back to the days of Greece, right? What is a confederacy as opposed to what we have now?
It's a looser collection.
Okay.
I think, the first two articles you just read out describe that nicely. It's a looser collection of sovereign autonomous entities who, for the purposes of something or other, decide to cooperate with one another to deliver that objective.
Right.
As you said, really, essentially winning the war, but that's done pretty quickly under the Articles, and perhaps not really because of the Articles in the end. But that's as opposed to the Union, which is, of course, established with the Constitution. That is something very different. And it is interesting because you mentioned that that's where the term United States of America comes from, the Articles, but it really doesn't create the United States in the way that we understand it, in the way, of course, that the Constitution does.
That's right.
That's orders of magnitude and qualitatively different kind of relationship between the states than the one established by the Articles of Confederation.
No, that's absolutely true. But they do establish the name early on. When you think about that, the document began being or was passed by the Second Continental Congress in 1777. That was the name they latched onto very early. But then Article 2, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. And that all sounds lovely and nice. Particularly people who are fans of the 10th Amendment to the current United States Constitution, who believe in states' rights and smaller, more localized government. But this also sounds more like an agreement between people who've decided to live together and not get married.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That we're going to be together in this, but you're completely sovereign to make the decisions you want unless we agree otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And by the way, in the Congress, the rules of the Congress itself, the decision-making rules reflect that great autonomy and the rights of individual states. So there are all sorts of procedures that make coming to a decision very difficult.
Right.
So there's supermajority rules. There is, for example, no previous question motion. I mean, I'm sure some of the listeners know what previous question, if they've ever been on
Robert's rules.
Robert's rules, so that where a majority can call the question to a close and put the matter to a final dispositive vote. There's none of that.
Wow.
So that's difficult to actually get votes. As I said, supermajorities needed. Bills or legislative measures were not privileged. So that means you often had to create majorities just to go to the next stage of the process or keep a debate on a matter going, not just to pass legislation. You need a supermajority to do that, but just to keep actual debate going. There was no real agenda-setting procedure, so there was the committees. To the extent they had committees, they were kind of ad hoc, but they didn't have any agenda-setting power. So it was a very freewheeling, disorganized, you might say, unstructured decision-making body. And you layer that on the fact that each individual state clearly retained its own sovereignty. It wasn't a very efficient institution, and it was unwieldy. And of course, this is the kind of stuff that leads people later on, not many years after the Treaty of Paris, to suggest it should not just be revised. And of course, at the Constitutional Convention, it was completely replaced.
Right. Entirely replaced. And you can understand as a war document, it makes some sense. We're a loose confederation that are throwing together regular troops and militia to somehow win this military conflict. But since we've not been officially recognized by most nations in the world, we don't actually have our own currency. We don't really have any sort of system of taxation. We don't have any sort of system of transportation. We don't know how to regulate trade yet. And so that's the document that you come up with, where you have a confederated government that is supposed to protect in national defense. That is stated very clearly and explicitly, but the government also has no power of taxation. It has no power to regulate trade. It can do very little to regulate the states, and it's very difficult to get anything through the Congress because, to your point, it's difficult to go through the rules. Basically, unless everybody has agreed on something beforehand, you're not really going to get it through the article or under the Articles of Confederation, right?
And each state had one vote as well. So, that's regardless of population. Right. And obviously there was tremendous variance in the sizes of the states by population, but each state had one vote. They may have many delegates who went to the Congress, but they only had one vote. And if your delegation was pretty large, sometimes it was difficult for them to agree on how to cast the state's vote.
Right. So can you briefly describe the government as you understand it under the Articles of Confederation? You've already mentioned there's no executive. There is a legislative assembly.
Yeah.
That consists of, 13 members?
Yeah, basically. Well, they're more, but more human beings, more individuals, but essentially 13 votes. Yes.
13. So they have to come together. The members of the states have to come together, and their vote together counts as one vote within the assembly.
Yes. I mean, they can decide how to cast it.
Right.
As you might imagine, there was kind of chronic absenteeism because there were, if you were part of a large delegation and you might have had business at home that really required your attention, you would say, well, look, I mean, I'm one of 7. I think the largest delegations were around 7 or 8, but I'm one of 7. I don't have much sway here. Those other guys can look after it. I don't really see this as being a good investment of my time.
Right.
And so often, delegates would not go to meetings, and given also, of course, the difficulties in travel and what have you.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it wasn't really built for effective decision making.
No,
to put it that way.
And I would argue that our current Constitution is built so that decision making is supposed to be slower.
Yes, absolutely.
But this sounds like it was built so that decision making was almost non-existent.
Yeah, well, particularly given the rules within what is the legislative body of the Confederate under the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
The rules were arcane and designed to protect the rights of individual states rather than allow for affirmative action for majorities to get things done that they wanted to be done. over the objections of minorities.
That's interesting. And then the members of the legislative branch were voted on every year instead of course, now we have the House of Representatives is every 2 years. Well, the state government's different, but the U.S. House of Representatives every 2 years, presidents every 4 years, senates every 6 years.
Yeah.
But this is every year, the first Monday of November.
Yeah, funnily enough, annual legislatures, wouldn't call them annual parliaments, that was nearly a British slip of the tongue there. Annual legislatures were very much part of the sort of revolutionary culture. And in fact, fast forward a little bit here, and I know it's not part of what we're talking about, but if you look at the debates at a number of the ratifying conventions in the states with regards to ratifying the U.S. Constitution, a lot of the opposition from many of the anti-federalists was based upon the fact that even those House terms at 2 years were too long, that there should be annual elections, and they thought that was, and this demonstrates here sort of the populist democratic fervor,
right?
That was part of American politics in the 1780s.
Right. Even now, today, of course, we live in a much different world, more connected because of the internet and television and all of that. It feels like as soon as we finish one election cycle, the next one has started.
Oh, yeah.
Who are the next candidates going to be almost immediately? And the thought of annual elections exhausts me.
Yes. I mean, my students say the same thing when I talk about this.
Sure.
I mean, they can't believe it. They think of, they understand our founders in the context of the time as being pretty liberal in the classical sense of the term, against institutions like monarchy, an aristocracy. And, where democracy lived in the world at the time was largely in the American states. But they can't believe that they were so wild to advocate for annual elections. I mean, that's that's too crazy. That's too liberal, too democratic.
Go back to the Athenian democracy, and everybody votes on everything.
Yeah, well, of course, the direct democracy. There's a strong tradition of that in parts of particularly in New England.
That's true. Yeah, though there is. I hadn't recalled that, but you're exactly right about that. So Articles 6, 7, 8, and 9 are interesting. They work together in that I'm paraphrasing, but Article 6 basically says no state can independently go out and create a treaty or whatever and sue for peace in that. Articles 7 and 8 talk about who is in charge of war and how we pay for land forces that are put together for the common defense. And then Article 9 says that all declarations of peace or war are reserved within this government. And that all sounds fine, again, for a wartime document until you get to 1781, 1782, 1783, and there's no need for these armed forces anymore, but the national government has accumulated wild amounts of debt because they've been defending themselves, right? So if you are a Confederate government that has no taxation power, but you have debt, how do you raise funds?
Yeah.
What's the answer on
that one?
Well,
I mean, a lot of the debts were held by the states. So they're the ones who are having to deal with it.
That's true.
And in fact, the Treaty of Paris, much of the debt, especially in places like North Carolina, was owed to British interests.
Yeah.
Whether that be, in Britain itself, corporations there, companies there, entities there, or in the British-held Caribbean.
Right.
Some of it was owed to people in the New England states as well. But it wasn't really the Confederate, because there is no real entity. I mean, it's the states that largely, and state residents that largely are bearing the debts from the war.
Sure.
And the Treaty of Paris in 1783 actually, sort of reinforces that point. And the British relinquish any real sort of ownership, or any ownership, or any attempt to consider the now 13 state satellites of the British Empire. But one thing that they do get is some kind of guarantee or confidence in that these debts that are owed to a lot of creditors, but a lot of them are owed to British interests, are going to get repaid.
Yeah.
And that really sort of escalates some of the economic problems that we see in the 1780s in places like North Carolina.
Yeah, in North Carolina, and it pops up in Massachusetts as well.
Yeah.
North Carolina in 1784 comes up with a novel solution because they understand that there's a national government with debt in addition to the state's own debt. And so all of the land between the charter said the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River, they mean the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, so Tennessee is what they mean. They passed a bill to give that land to the national government. And the thought process was that the national government could sell that land to potential landowners, started as a new state, but that would help drive down the national debt. But then there were some questions for people who lived in the area at the time, particularly in northeast Tennessee, or what is now northeast Tennessee. They weren't sure that the federal government was going to take up the bill. They also liked the idea of being independent of the state government of North Carolina. And so they petitioned the federal government. One of their leaders was, we talked about him in previous episodes, particularly with Kings Mountain, John Sevier.
Yep.
Who goes on to be governor of Tennessee.
First governor.
And they petitioned to be the state of Franklin. Can you tell us a little bit about the Franklin controversy?
Well, you've set it up pretty nicely. I think this needs to be put in the context as well of sort of cultural differences and economic differences within North Carolina.
Fair enough.
So this is the backcountry. This is the far west of the state, obviously. That even today we know is having a different kind of personality and culture from the eastern part of the state.
Absolutely.
So there is a history in the western part of the state of, well, let me put it this way. First of all, it's very different economically to the eastern part of the state. So the vast majority of commerce is in the eastern part of the state. And the eastern part of the state, as a result, by the way, is very much more, will be, as we go through the 1780s, very much more receptive to the Constitution and to the creation of a stronger national government than the western part of the state. North Carolina as a whole will be pretty anti-federalisty, as we said. Right. Will be the 12th state to ratify the Constitution. Of course, the first time around it rejected it at the Hillsborough Convention, finally does it at Fayetteville the next year. But within North Carolina, the eastern part of the state is much more receptive because it's more integrated into trade patterns within the United States and also with European powers, particularly Britain. And, it's trading stuff. This is where, by the way, at the time in the 1780s, is roughly 1/4 of North Carolinians are enslaved. So there's about 300,000 free, about 100,000 slaves. Roughly, that's roughly the figure. And they're in the eastern part of the state. We know this from our Civil War history, but that's where they are residing, and so this is where a lot of the agriculture is. There's not really any cotton at the time. There's tobacco. There's corn. There's actually hogs, pigs, pork at the time as well, which is interesting.
So we still do that.
We still do that, very much so. Lumber. Anybody who's driven across the state these days knows that we've got a lot of trees. We've still got a lot of trees.
Still.
And also a lot of goods that were important for the British Navy, like tar and pitch and turpentine and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So
naval stores,
yes. So the eastern part of the state but the western part's very different. The western part is more insular for obvious reasons. It's more geographically remote. The people who settle are different. There aren't slaves out there. Right. You get a kind of cultural coherence with the influx of a sizable number of migrants from, or what today we call the Scots-Irish, or from Northern Ireland, parts of the north of Ireland and Scotland, who come to that area.
People may see the term Ulster Scots.
Yes.
Right.
Yep. There's also very much a sort of connection still with the attitudes and ideas of the regulator movement from, roughly 15 years previous to 1760s, early 1770s.
That was episode 1 of the podcast. That's great.
So we don't need a recap.
Full circle.
We know
well
everybody's
done.
listened to all of them.
Obviously, they have.
Yes. So so there's a real difference, and there's a sense of there's a real populist feeling. There's a sense of desire to be left alone. And there's a sense that they've been sort of economically put upon. And Sevier and others sort of take advantage of this, particularly in that confusion between when when North Carolina doesn't know what it wants to do with it. They all feel like orphans, not cared about.
Right.
And you have this effort. Well, they call themselves the state of Franklin.
They do.
And although never recognized, this really goes on right until the Constitutional Convention, even a little bit past then.
I think the name itself, we don't talk about this much when you read about the state of Franklin controversy. And just spoiler for everybody, Franklin never becomes a state.
Right.
But the fact that it was named Franklin at all. Benjamin Franklin, we think of today as the guy on the $100 bill, discovered lightning as electricity, had some newspapers, had funny little sayings, but he was also incredibly politically popular among the 13 colonies, 13 states, because he represented not all of them, but a lot of them as their parliamentary delegate in Britain. And so you'll find the name Franklin pop up in a lot of places, including this. They did it almost expressly to get Benjamin Franklin's political support for their creation. But if you look at Georgia, Benjamin Franklin represented Georgia to Parliament, and so when they decided to create a public college, now there's some controversy here because the University of North Carolina claims to be the oldest public university in the country, but so does the University of Georgia, and they're both right. The University of North Carolina was, in fact, the first public university, but the University of Georgia began with Franklin College, which is now the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Georgia, and it is, in fact, older than the University of North Carolina. But you see Benjamin Franklin's name pop up everywhere, and they did this to get his political support, which I think he did, to some extent, sort of support them and give them at least, words of gratitude and words of support, but he couldn't quite get them over the line with the Confederation government to take them in as the 14th state.
Yeah. No, Franklin's fingerprints are everywhere.
They are.
In this period, and he was a superstar. He was a rock star. And
he was.
Particularly, you can imagine he's in the hornet's nest, right, when he's in London, basically trying to sweet talk the ostensible enemy.
Yeah, trying to get the Tea Act repealed and all these other things, and fails, but he tries really hard. So Richard Caswell, we've heard this man's name pop up an awful lot as we go through this history. We first meet him in the regulator movement as an officer with Governor Tryon battling against the regulators, and then we find him as an officer with the Patriots at the Battle of Morris Creek. He's popped up as an officer here and there, but he's also, at this point in history, the governor of North Carolina, and he actually tries to reconcile with John Sevier, and they know each other. These men have met each other because they were at the 5th Provincial Congress together when North Carolina wrote its first constitution. So they've met before, or at least been in the same room. I don't know that they were buddies, but he sort of tries to put a conciliatory policy to Franklin, come back. We weren't trying to forget about you. We were just basically trying to create another state, but not the one you're trying to create at this point. What happens with the state of Franklin? It's a weird sort of thing to describe, that it existed in its own way. Nobody did anything to them. Right.
Well, you've got to remember the geographic remoteness of this. We forget that, right? Because we can get around so easily these days. Mm-hmm. But once you get right out, you've got to traverse the Appalachians. Mm-hmm. It's a long way. Knoxville from New Bern is a long way today.
Yeah.
And as I said, I don't think the state really knows what it wants to do with it. It doesn't know what the value of the situation of the state of Franklin is, whether it makes sense to have to just basically try to bring it back in and quell any potential rebellion, or let those guys do whatever they want. Do they have the capacity to do so? And I think there's probably a significant amount of sympathy, even back east, given the sort of general political culture of North Carolina at the time. As I mentioned before,
it's very east heavy.
It's east heavy, but there is in North Carolina, through the regulator movement, etc., a populist, independent streak, and that severe. I mean, and himself as well as a war hero. I mean, his role at Kings Mountain makes him someone who clearly is a patriotic American.
That's right.
And so, who are we to question this crazy thing that he's doing? To a certain extent, it might sound subversive and seditious, but actually, how could someone like him be like that?
Right. I think on its surface it sounds seditious, but then you think through, well, how did any other state start?
Yeah.
Well, not that differently from what he's trying to do in what is now East Tennessee. Essentially, they run a pseudo-independent state from 1784 to 1789. Nobody stops them, but
and that's after the Constitution.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
because
I wonder if they want. I wonder. I don't even know the answer to this, so I probably shouldn't ask the question. But for the Philadelphia Convention, I wonder if Sevier and others sort of said, we should gate crash.
That's a great question. I haven't even thought about that.
They obviously didn't have, because they weren't recognized. They weren't issued an invitation to send a delegate or delegates.
Right.
But get someone up to Philadelphia and knock on the door and say, look, we want in on this.
Oh, I've never thought about that. That is a really great
point. And Annapolis as well, before in 1786.
We should gate crash the Philadelphia Convention.
Yeah.
Heck, I'd like to gate crash the Philadelphia Convention. That'd be interesting.
Go back in a time machine. Yeah.
Yeah.
But for different reasons than any potential delegates from the state of Franklin, probably. So just to see what's going on. Yeah.
We've hinted around at what we view as functional problems with the Articles of Confederation and the Congress that it created versus the current United States Constitution. And the next episode of the podcast gets to the ratification of that Constitution by North Carolina. But if you could get to what do you think were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? And then we'll get into maybe some specifics on that. How did it affect
Well, obviously, I think there was a sense that there needed to be greater coherence and centralization by a lot of people than what was provided by the Articles. That many people weren't quite sure, perhaps, what the final relationship between the states and any federal or national government should be precisely. Right. But there should be more of a centralized power,
right,
than there was currently. And we've just mentioned the state of Franklin. There were a number of states that were struggling to maintain order and to be able to maintain stable governance. Perhaps the incident that really pushes a lot of delegates. They're already sort of selected, almost as they're thinking about packing their bags to Philadelphia. Over the edge is Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. But Shays' Rebellion is a microcosm of things that are occurring across the country and including in North Carolina.
Right, because there's basically an economic depression.
Yes, and this was a class of farmers, debtors, who were being crushed economically and wanted policymakers to provide them, in this case the Massachusetts state government, to provide some kind of reprieve. And in North Carolina, you mentioned the debts that were being that many individual North Carolinians and the state held. This was a problem more so in North Carolina.
Right.
There were efforts by the government in North Carolina to address these things. So again, sort of in line with North Carolina's position, closer to what we would recognize as a sort of states' rights anti-federalist end, rather than a central government federalist end, despite the connections and the support for ideas of federalism in the East. Loyalist property, the property of loyalists, was often seized as a way of sort of trying to, maybe sometimes more lashing out politically, but as a way of trying to address economic problems. There was paper currency. You mentioned currency earlier on. There was paper currency issued, and inevitably it wasn't worth very much. It increased inflation. But
there was a national currency.
Yes.
That's what, but states could also have their own currency if they wanted to as well, which further confused the situation.
Right, but and created a lack of confidence in whatever currency was being issued. But that was not bad for debtors.
No.
Because by increasing inflation in prices, it made the relative cost of debt lower.
Right.
So there were these efforts, but the politics of the time in the state of the 1780s is fraught, and really the great division is on these sort of occupational and class lines having to do with debt and credit, the nature of the farming that you do. Do you trade, or do you sort of have a small farm?
Right.
And of course, that also affects your politics, because it makes you suspicious of governmental power and centralized power, or it makes you wanting it to provide greater coordination, and also national defense, and a more sort of coordinated foreign policy, particularly with regards to trade.
Right. People may not realize, because we don't have as much of an agrarian society as we used to have, but to be a farmer by trade is to be in debt by trade. You are in debt until you sell your crops and you get out of debt, but then you go immediately back into debt to get enough, seed or whatever you need, or more land to plant again, and then you're in debt until you can get out of debt again.
And this is a recurring theme in American history as well. I mean, the populists of the late 19th century.
Right.
This is essentially the argument that they have. In this case, it's more of a national argument than a statewide or regional argument, but it's against the commercial interests of the major cities of the northeastern part of the United States, and also the railroads and the industrialists.
Right.
We see that. We see it. That's 200 years, or 100 years, I should say. Sorry, 100 years later, almost a facsimile of what we see during the 1780s.
Yeah, no, we see that a lot. We see it in the 1780s and the 1790s. A lot of the early debates, a lot of the early economic debates after the Constitution is passed have to do with trade and tariffs.
Yeah.
Because Southern farmers don't want tariffs because they want to be able to get cheap goods from Europe, but Northern industrialists want basically the stuff that they're making in an industrial capacity to be sold to the southern states and keep all that trade internal. Yeah, we're having that debate now.
Absolutely, and we will. I think we'll have it for a long time.
Yeah.
One other thing I should say, Donald, about this sort of east-west divide, if you want to call it that, in North Carolina, which it is the West. I think we sort of mentioned this, but the West with State Franklin, the West is the frontier. And for those people who sort of read Frederick Turner Maine, the old frontier thesis argument, it does create a different kind of character in the people. Not least in terms of their personal safety in dealing with the native tribes.
Interesting.
So there is back east, it's hard to think of Eastern North Carolina in some ways as cosmopolitan, right?
Right.
But it was. I mean, Wilmington's a very important port. The eastern part of the state. This is where, as I said, slaves were. This is where a lot of the products that were traded were produced. The western part of the state's right on the frontier there, and they are in constant conflict with Indian tribes,
Right.
And battling sort of for basic survival. And there are a number of episodes and conflicts, particularly with the Cherokees.
Right.
Chickamauga's a little bit as well.
If listeners remember back to the Kings Mountain episode, and we talked about John Sevier and the Over Mountain Men, and they were over the mountain, over the mountain into Tennessee. But they were dealing with a lot of conflict with the what they call themselves, the Chickamauga Cherokees.
Yeah, Chickamauga.
And we mentioned then in that episode that Dragon Canoe and the backcountry mountain war that Dragon Canoe was waging on those settlers didn't end until Dragon Canoe died in 1792.
Oh, well, yeah.
We're talking, if we're talking about Shays's Rebellion, which is 1786 to 1787. We're talking another 5 years past that.
Well, so, the United States is in full swing.
Right. It is. It's 3 years after the Constitution's ratified.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so that, I think that's probably a difference as well, between the kind of concerns, interests, general day-to-day existence of people who lived in the East to people who lived on the frontier there, in the backcountry out west.
I think Shays's Rebellion, which happens in Massachusetts in August 1786 to February 1787, Daniel Shays, I think I said for many years it was Shays' Rebellion, but it's Shays's Rebellion. You said it very well. He led a group of 1,200 armed men against the National Arsenal at Springfield, which there's still a National Arsenal at Springfield. They were asking for a lot of judicial reforms and reforms related to preventing foreclosures and that sort of thing, which goes exactly to what you're talking about. But it does raise a lot of questions, and so does the state of Franklin on perhaps there's some shortcomings with this national government we've created in that it's difficult to raise an army to defend itself now that we're not in active conflict. If there is an army, we don't know how to fund it. We don't know how to fund all these other things where there's no really provision for how to regulate trade or levy taxes or have a national currency or put backing behind that currency. Because remember, at this time, if there was a national currency, it would have been backed by the gold or silver standard. But if you can't accumulate that gold, then what's the currency based on?
Right.
So this leads to, I think, a lot of people really questioning the strength and wisdom of the Articles of Confederation. When do we really see these questions start popping up, and who's bringing up those questions nationally? Yeah, well, there is a class of a number of the founding class who, of course, are interested in moving towards greater union than this loose confederation has. Right. Many of them in the sort of many of the traditional sort of class of revolutionaries, Massachusetts and Virginia, the sort of American aristocrats. Right. But people like James Madison, for example, who is, he really is, particularly at the Constitutional Convention, but even before, thinking in terms of, the Articles just don't work. They're beyond redemption. Right. You can't repair them. They need to be root and branch replaced. Start over. I mean, the ostensibly the charge after Annapolis is for a meeting to revise the Articles of Confederation, but it's pretty clear once you get to Philadelphia and the dynamics of the Constitutional Convention, it's going to be more than that. That's in some ways they got ahead of their skis. Because the ratifying conventions, we mentioned North Carolina, and I know you're going to do the last episode on this, but a lot of the it's not just North Carolina, it's a lot of, and some of the biggest states,
particularly in Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York, not so much Pennsylvania. But those three, it's not clear that this thing's going to get ratified. But I think you really see it in 1785, 1786. But Shays' rebellion brings it home to a lot of people because their real concern is with stability and law and order, and there's a sense that the state governments can't do it on their own. You would have these contagions across state lines. You need greater coordination to maintain stability, order, help the economy, and increasingly there are people who are sharing the sort of Madisonian view that we need to scrub these articles and move on.
Yeah. In North Carolina, you start hearing from a few louder voices like Hugh Williamson is a name that comes up of Edenton, North Carolina, but also from Edenton is a young man at that time named James Iredell. Yeah. And he becomes a very outspoken voice on the Federalist side, doesn't go to the Philadelphia Convention, but he is outspoken at the Hillsborough Convention and the Fayetteville Convention. But James Iredell, just so everybody knows, he's a native of Edenton, North Carolina, but he goes on to be one of the first Supreme Court justices, the federal Supreme Court justice, which is an interesting little feather in the hat for North Carolina. You've mentioned the Annapolis Convention a few times, and I think people are familiar with the Philadelphia Convention where the Constitution is inevitably written. But what is this Annapolis Convention you've mentioned a few times?
Well, it's kind of a halfway house. I mean, there is this between where we are and getting the Constitution. There is this concern we just talked about that's growing, that the articles are clearly inadequate, possibly irrelevant and beyond repair. And there's this meeting at Annapolis of delegates from various states who sort of who come to this conclusion, and they call upon the states, all 13 states, to formally, Annapolis is more informal, to formally, these are prominent members of their governing elites in the states. They've been members of the Congress, delegates to the Congress, I should say. They've been prominent in the state's public life, who are then go to their states and say, we need to send a formal delegation to this meeting in Philadelphia, where they really deal with the articles. And as I said, the charge is to reform or revise, amend, rather than replace. But that's what happens in the end.
They end up replacing. Yeah.
Only Rhode Island doesn't actually end up sending delegates to the Philadelphia Convention.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk now, particularly on the more conservative side of American politics, where people talk about the need for an Article 5 convention to, add in, the people adding in an amendment or forcing in an amendment on a balanced budget or term limits or something like that. But the fear that you hear from a lot of conservatives about an Article 5 convention would be that it would be a runaway convention, that we couldn't control it and it wouldn't be limited to just what it was. But a lot of that fear comes from the fact that the Philadelphia Convention was in some ways a runaway convention. They were supposed to amend and not replace, but they replaced.
They replaced, but there was still the ratification. They needed 9 states to ratify. I mentioned earlier we were 12. So there's actually a period in North Carolina history for about a year when we are in this sort of provisional state. We're like on probation or whatever. We're not part of the United States because we haven't ratified the Constitution. But the United States exists. There are at least 9, and then there goes to be 10 or 11 states who are signed on and in, and North Carolina's kind of waiting there. I guess it's inevitable in the end, once we get to the Fayetteville Convention, that there's going to be the ratification. But the runaway analogy is fairly apt, I think. Yeah, I mean, as I said, the charge is more explicitly to revise the articles rather than replace. And you can imagine with these very influential, smart people, there's a small group of delegates, there's 55 who go to Philadelphia. Only 39 end up signing. There are a lot of, there's a lot of people who leave kind of in disgust because of this sort of runaway nature, I guess you could call it, of the convention. And you get in the room. It's you're at the top of your game. That this is the most important thing that's really ever happened on the continent.
Yeah.
Today, you feel powerful and important. You get people like particularly James Madison waxing eloquent about how we need to do something.
Right.
And you get swept up in it, and then all of a sudden you leave. There's a famous apocryphal story. You're talking about Franklin about when they finish,
right?
And the woman asks him, "What did you give us, Mr. Franklin? A republic, if you can keep it."
Right.
Well, what that suggests is. I'm not really interested in the Republic part of it, but that it was a surprise, that people didn't know what was going to happen.
Right.
And there were a lot of people who were actually really annoyed.
Are we going to make George Washington king? What's this going to be?
Yeah. I mean, there were some delegates like, John Dixon from Pennsylvania who thought that was a really good idea. But what do we got? And then once they realized what they got, they felt conned because they thought they were getting a revision of the Articles. Instead, they got something new.
They got something new altogether. Let me ask you about the legacy of the Articles of Confederation. It's a fascinating time in history because it's a large political philosophy debate nationally, essentially is what it comes down to. But do you think that the Articles of Confederation were a failure, or were they a necessary stepping stone to get to where we are now?
Well, clearly there had to be something between what were really, at least theoretically, in practice they weren't because of their proximity to one another and their distance from Britain and Europe. The 13 states were never really, as a practical matter, even a legal matter, but as a practical matter, completely separated. Right? They couldn't be. They couldn't afford to be.
Right.
But there was still something that had to happen between that and then the creation of the Union and the writing and the ratification of the Constitution of the United States.
Right.
You can't go from one to the other without some kind of coordinated sort of route,
right.
and that there would be some kind of midpoint where you take a rest, and it's sort of you've done some of the work, but you've still got more to go. But having said that, in defense of the Articles, I think one of the problems with the Articles, and I think you did a really good job in explaining it, at least to me, was that by the time they were finally ratified, because you needed all 13, not like the Constitution where you needed 9,
right?
And Maryland got around to it. For the most part, the war was nearly won,
right?
And really, they were created for the purposes of prosecuting the war.
Right.
Now, the value in having a coordinated foreign policy in the 1780s is not missed on me. I see the value in that, but they were written for a time when quick action was required.
Right.
And not only did they not allow quick action, but the states' hesitancy in ratifying the Articles meant that they were almost, out of date at the time that they were put into place.
Right. That they were having to make a much faster decisions than I think we appreciate now. It's really interesting, right? We talk about how slow Congress moves now and how fast they move, or after the current Iraqi government was set up, there was a lot of debate over how long it took them to write a constitution. But we had to do this under duress in America, in not the modern world, and that I think that does complicate a lot of things. But the lack of power of taxation, the fact that they were having to make decisions on the fly, meant that George Washington was in fact financing a lot of the Army himself. I'm going to give a lecture here in a couple of weeks here at the John Locke Foundation on the legacy of Joseph Hughes, who was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, and John Adams calls him the first Secretary of the Navy before there was the term. But you read into the history and you find out that Joseph Hughes is shelling out his own money to outfit ships and buy cannon and reinforce all these planks and things like that. And he spends what would now be millions of dollars in his own money because the Congress has no money and doesn't really have a formalized government at this point. And so they were kind of driving the car while they were building it.
Yeah. Yes.
It's a crazy time in history.
Yeah. Most definitely. Most definitely.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your insights. If you liked this episode, click that like button and share. We really appreciate you listening in, and we look forward to having you back on episode 10 as we talk about the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in our final episode.